Okay, hello everybody. Warm welcome. I'm Vicki Squire. I'm a Professor of International Politics at Department of Politics and International Studies at University of Warwick. Really happy to be here as Principal Investigator of the Data and Displacement Project with team members today. We've got Dr. Bryony Jones, who is co-investigator on the project and who's Associate Professor of International Development at Warwick in the PACE department as well. We've got Grant Tregenning, Research Fellow on the project, located at the Institute for Global Sustainable Development at Warwick. And we've got Dr. Prithvi Hirani, a Research Fellow on the project, working for the global team of the Displacement Tracking Matrix at teams at International Organization for Migration. So just to give a kind of brief introduction to the Data and Displacement Project first, the aim of the project is to advance critical understanding and I guess improve processes of data-driven protection for people who are displaced in situations of conflict. So we're focusing on the provision of assistance in camps in northern Nigeria and South Sudan. And the research is embedded in a participatory ethos, which is what we're going to be discussing today, what this participatory ethos means. We're particularly concerned in the project to engage with and engage insights of people who are displaced in the assessment of digital humanitarianism. And I think for us in the project, that means that we're aiming not to extract information from those research participants, but to find ways to provide space for voices of IDPs to come through in discussions about the production and use of their data. So I'm really happy to have a conversation with the team members about this participatory ethos. And we're going to think a bit about what's distinctive about this. Why is it important when it comes to research with people who are displaced, but also what challenges arises in situations of precarity and conflict. So I'm going to direct the questions as we go along to particular team members, but this is the aim is to have a conversation today. So I really encourage everybody to jump in, raise your hand, jump in if you want to at any point. That's absolutely fine. We're not too structured. First off, let's think about what's distinctive about participatory ethos then. As I said, for me, it's about really striving not to have this extractive approach to our field work. But Grant, I know you've done sort of a lot of work with different communities. Can you say a bit about what it means for you?
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. So for me, I mean, it really changes between each application of projects and methods. But for me, it's really about engaging with communities and trying to understand and resolve community-based problems that are, of course, context-specific, and really to try and empower communities and democratize research. And of course, this can be done by a whole range of methods. So things such as group discussions based on people's lived and personal experiences, interviews, surveys, and sort of analysis of public documents as well. What I really strive to do is to try and understand and know what the community wants and needs, and try and not make assumptions based on what those problems may be before we enter the field. And of course, some of those assumptions that we use are based on ideas of white masculine and westernized models or rhetoric. So it's really an idea about engaging with the community, trying to not have assumptions and really understand what they want, what they need. And of course, that's a top-down and bottom-up approach, a whole collaborative approach there. And there's more radical approaches of doing that. So there's things such as living lab methodologies, which are user-centered and participatory designed. So they're really grounded in being context-specific and operate in territorial contexts, so things such as cities or other administrative boundaries or regions. And it's really about the research and innovation collaborating with public, private and civil partnerships. So again, not this sort of top-down rhetoric that we see in a lot of white masculine and westernized models. It's more about this collaborative bottom-up grassroots rhetoric as well, and about how we can have a co-creation approach of knowledge as well. So an idea of exploration, experimentation, evaluation, and working with the members of community to move towards a collective goal or idea, and of course have that evolve over time as well. So continually learn, unlearn, reflect, and evaluate on our ideas and methods that we're using. At the moment, we have this modern era where big data introduced this realm of datafication, where lots and lots of data was being collected and processed. And really, at the moment, we're seeing in sort of the methodologies that I'm using. So I use a lot of geospatial methods and visualization methods, and the methods that we tend to use in our field are grounded in these ideas of white masculinity and westernized models. And because of that, larger scale processes of information, of data and capitalism can eclipse some of these humanitarian-based processes or humanitarian development interventions that we're really wanting to move towards. And of course, that isn't our intentions, but just how things are framed at the moment, that often can lead to that. So again, this can sometimes lead to this idea of data by dispossession, and eventually disempower the communities because of the framework that we're working in. So my role and sort of my experience that I've seen is to really work with members of the community to try and actually figure out what they want and provide solutions to those sort of problems that they may be experiencing. And I use a lot of visualization and geospatial methods to do this. And are really allowing a lot of space for flexibility in the design and implementation of those. So I mentioned earlier this idea of datafication and the methodologies that are sort of embedded in Western and white masculine ideologies, and I think it's really important to critique those and critique the framework that they operate in at the moment, to sort of give voice to the challenges and demand for alternative models of data practices and epistemologies. Yeah. That's kind of my perspective on it. And of course, that's my view from sort of visualization and geospatial applications. And of course, a different critique and rhetorical come from somewhere else. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Grant. I'm struck by this point you make about the kind of eclipse of the voices and the concerns and the kind of communities that are being served actually being rendered invisible with this move towards datafication. And I think that was a kind of concern driving this project, where we felt this project was really important. That IDPs just are lost, right, in this massive data-driven activity. So I think the question, I've got a question, and this would be great to direct to Prithvi, who comes from a more practitioner perspective. Why would this participatory approach be important with IDPs, and particularly in that context of datafication that Grant raises?
Thank you, Vicki. I think this is a really interesting question, and particularly when we think about even the humanitarian sector and the changes in the humanitarian sector over the last 10 years. There is a massive move towards more data, towards more sophisticated forms of data collection, and I think that's where even these broader discussions about datafication have made their way into humanitarian practice as well, and to a large extent, that there is this notion of more data is better data. But I think in parallel to these advances and the use of sophisticated data collection methods and innovation being a big buzzword in the humanitarian sector, as well as big data and so on, there is also a simultaneous move and impetus to undertake a more human rights approach to data. And looking at these two forces or these two kind of trends together is really important. And I think that when we do look at a human rights-based approach to data, one of the principles that stands out to me particularly is that of participation, and participation is central to human rights, and when we think about it in relation to human rights and data collection, as well as the participation of displaced populations or those who are affected by humanitarian or development crises. We need to think about a more people-centric approach. It's really important that because of these moves and all these current changes that are taking place, we ensure that we do not forget about people, and that data does not necessarily replace or eclipse, as you said, the very fact that these are ultimately people who have needs, who are extremely vulnerable, and who are in very precarious situations. And I think in that sense, I think taking a participatory approach and using it as an ethos to ground our research kind of centers again the IDP or the person in the middle, which is something that is again, as I said, very important and also really necessary when we think about questions of representation, when we think about how participation enables or includes different voices and ensures, that this is in line with leaving no one behind, ensuring that no one falls through the cracks. And I think, I think it's really important to look at these two kind of trends together and see. And again, I think we're focusing on this a lot in our project by centering on the IDPs and displaced populations and using their participation in a meaningful way, not in an extractive and exploitative way, but as an entry point and an invitation, particularly since a lot of these groups, due to datafication and a lot of data collection activities, can also be fatigued as a result of lots of assessments and so on. So these are also factors to consider when we do think about participation and participatory approaches.
Thanks, Prithvi. It's really interesting, isn't it, to hear that the humanitarian sector is also really taking this kind of concern with participation and thinking about data in this rights-based framework. And I guess, I think it'd be really interesting for another discussion to have a lot more around that and the challenges that are posed in the humanitarian sector. Because I'm sure actually translating that in practice is a very different matter, isn't it? And I think for us in this project, particularly doing the work in situations of conflict, situations of extreme precarity for some of our research participants, I think this question of what a participatory approach means really requires more reflection, doesn't it? Because the kind of relations of power, dynamics of power, don't disappear. They're still there even when we take a participatory approach. So I think, really like to ask Bryony here about the challenges this approach poses in these sort of contexts and how you would view those, the importance of the participatory approach, but also, the challenges of it.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Vicki. And, I've really enjoyed just then listening to Grant and Prithvi and your kind of reflections and response, Vicki, because there's always this question of whether or not the problem we face when we're working in the kinds of fields we work in is a problem of lack of knowledge or a problem of the kind of ethical relationship we have to that knowledge and to the people that the knowledge is supposed to represent. And I think, so I'm quite pleased to be able to have that conversation with you today about ethics, because I think we have some very well developed now ethics frameworks and review processes, particularly for academic research, but beyond that as well. And these are obviously important. I don't want to suggest that they're not important, but they're developed and, from my perspective, speak to quite stable research environments often, knowable research environments. So the idea that you can predict the unpredictable. And of course, when we're working in conflict and post-conflict situations like we are in this project and many others in their work, that's just not really the case. They're highly politicized, aren't they? They're highly unstable and unpredictable, not always, but often. and are kind of full of risks of doing harm in our research. And so I think on the one hand, that makes it even more important, actually, to be applying participatory approaches. But it means that some of the standard questions we have when we're doing participatory research, so who actually participates and is included, it's not every IDP that we're going to be speaking to, right? So who are we sampling and speaking to? How are we going to respond to what they tell us? And how do we manage raising their expectations when they participate? Those are sort of standard methodological questions, but I think they become really difficult to navigate in conflict and post-conflict contexts and working with IDPs like we are. And so you kind of have this sensitive intersection of the nature of the field being less predictable, the kind of principles that we all want to meet when we're doing our research, and then how we react to kind of a dynamic situation when we're actually working with the IDPs, working with them, hopefully very much so, in generating the data together. And just as kind of like a small example, when I was in Bosnia in 2007, 2008, working with IDPs in the north of the country, I really wanted to try and get beyond sort of semi-structured interviews and going to do elite interviews about the situation, particularly in a contested area where there've been multiple levels of displacement, and the land ownership was very contested following the 92-95 war. And so what I decided to do was to ask someone from the community to walk around with me and to describe the place to me, because I thought this would be interesting to understand how they connected, how the place made sense in terms of belonging. But of course, what I did was create problems for myself and divisions in the community, because I'd selected a particular person to walk around with me. And so I got their perspective. But then when I wanted to do the same thing with the other members of other groups, identity groups in the community, it became very difficult because I'd already picked my side. And so that's different to the work we're doing in our project, but I think it's a concrete example of how we maybe need to think through some of the ethical challenges, particularly in politicized contexts where there will be different identities and maybe histories of violence. And if I can, I'd maybe just add on quickly that I think beyond the kind of maybe potential limits of our ethical frameworks, I'd say that participatory research does demand a lot more of the participants. So it's quite different to having like a half an hour interview in someone's office and you make notes and leave and say thanks very much. You know, you're really working with them and you're asking for their time, but also their ideas, their knowledge, and we're kind of hoping to use that. And we don't obviously want to homogenize or patronize the IDPs that we're going to be working with, but they're, you know, a much higher likelihood that there will be traumas and vulnerabilities that also Prithvi's mentioned, and she has obviously that close experience in her work of seeing that firsthand. And so, of course, we need to make sure that our research is substantial and not frivolous, but it's not automatically less extractive. And I think we obviously have had that in mind with our project design and project research, but the power relationships around who benefits from the research ultimately doesn't necessarily change. And so, of course, we hope it will. But what I really like about the conversation we're having today and the way we're organising our project is we can have that inbuilt ongoing reflection to kind of make sure that when we apply the participatory methods as we want to, that it's very thoughtful and deliberative, that it's not like a tick box exercise, as I think sometimes it can become that. And I think it needs to be something that's, I mean, Grant mentioned this as well in his previous experience, we have to always be reflecting and seeing how the method is playing out. So yeah, so those would just be some of my initial thoughts in response.
Really interesting. Thanks, Bryony. Very struck by the experience that you shared. And I think, I guess what your reflections point to for me is that no intervention in a field can be innocent, right? You know, there's no way that you can go in and do research without having some sort of impact. And the important thing is to be aware of that and really sensitive to that, and to build in reflection throughout. And of course, they're really big questions, aren't they? I'm sure. I was thinking as well, when you're talking about ethics frameworks and the difficulties of the limits of ethics frameworks in these contexts, I was thinking, you know, I'm sure a lot of our colleagues working in more stable contexts would also point to the limits of kind of these ethics frameworks that we have to go through, and this sort of process of translation that we've been working with as a team of, how do we work with that ethics framework that we have to go through a process of submitting, but also make ethical considerations really meaningful in our project. And I think one of the things you said as you were talking was, how do we do the research with IDPs? And that word "with" being really crucial. And I know not a straightforward process always, but I thought it would be helpful to share a bit about some of the ways that we're trying to do that in the project, how we're translating this participatory ethos into our strategy when we're going into doing our field work. I know, Grant, you already mentioned some of the issues around visualization work that you've done. Maybe you could say a little bit about this from your perspective, and anyone else, of course, join in as well.
Yeah, thanks, Vicki. So similar to Bryony, really, making assumptions before going into the field and then experiencing that they've created further problems. So, for example, for me, making assumptions based on the tools and data collection methods, and again, what those problems may be before working with the community groups. And I've got a few different experience of those, but I don't want to focus on that. Maybe I just want to talk about some of the methods that we're trying to implement into data and displacement. And yeah, I really like this idea of what Bryony just spoke about earlier, in terms of this continuous process of sort of learning and unlearning and reflection and evaluation. And it made me start to think about some of the methods that we're hoping to use, and that I'm using in part of the design of the visualization methods in this project, to try and to have this ethos of critical pedagogical thinking, where we actually have skilled learners that we're learning from in the field, in our case, the IDPs. So trying to sort of dismantle this this process, which often exists in research projects when we go into the field, and it's a bit of a top-down learning process. So we have the teacher and the learner, where actually we need to dismantle that, and it's a really collaborative approach, and we have a lot to learn from them, and then that can kind of feed into the design of our methods. So in my experience in this project, I'm hoping to go into the field with some questions as part of the group, and ask how the IDPs interact with existing visualization techniques. So trying to understand issues of accessibility, marginalization, and this idea that Prithvi was mentioning about people falling through the cracks. So trying to sort of dismantle existing approaches that are really based on those colonized frameworks. I hope that kind of answers your question there. I know the other two will probably have some input there as well, but I could talk about that forever.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. Do the others want to come in at this point with anything?
Yeah, sure. I think, like Bryony, some of the things that you raised, and about participation in the field, and how that may raise so many, not only ethical questions, but also questions of how you may be perceived and the choices that you make. And I think, thinking about it from our point of view, and even in the project, I think it's really important that with participation, we also think about transparency around participation, in terms of what are the choices, or how were these selection processes done? Were they circumstantial? Were they deliberate? And in to a large extent, even participation may may be underlined by so many different social, cultural, political factors, and just probably bearing mind to that and understanding participation through a lens of transparency and equity, and as much as clear as we can be about the process, is something that can enable, or at least reflect on, some of those conflicts that we may feel at some point, with the values that we want to fulfill, but also what may be the ground reality. And another thing that came to my mind was also about this question of participation as an active choice, we sometimes forget that, as you said, earlier, participation is not just a box ticking exercise. We're not looking at it from the point of view of, here we're going to the field and we're going to interview X number of IDPs. That's it, tick, that was done. But it's more of a choice that is actively made. And I think, thinking about what you said, Grant, it's not just it's a two-way participation, right? It's if we're dismantling the relationship between teacher and student, then even participation is from both sides. It's from the researcher and those who we are talking to on the field. And I think in that sense, both have equal agency, both are active participants, and they can constantly negotiate and choose their level of participation throughout that process. And I guess for us, it's just important to be mindful of that and to consider that that process, when we think about participation, is not just at one step, but it's like throughout this like holistic, or when we think about data collection, right, from how we're choosing to who we're talking to are we specifically looking at particular groups so that we can invite them into the conversation. All these sorts of different ways in which we, I guess, negotiate participation, I think for me is like an important way to look at it as an ethos, and to look at it in terms of how we guide our questions and some of the challenges that it may even raise for us in the field.
Maybe if it's all right, sorry, Vicki, just to jump in, because I think that's really, that transparency, of course, is incredibly important, and making sure that we write that into how we present our own knowledge that we generate from the research that we're doing. And then I kind of wonder, in the context of our project, of course, we have the kind of the visualization work we're going to be doing with the IDPs, and asking them to think about and represent their own experiences with data and how it's collected. But also alongside that, we're generating other sources of information through stakeholder interviews, aren't we? Which might well be less than, not necessarily, but less participatory. They might be more kind of semi-structured, or about getting a sense of some important background or contextual information. And so I think for me also, in our analysis process, I'm interested to see how, as a project team, we sit those different forms of information, side by side. So in that sense, kind of asking always what the limits of learning from the IDPs are going to be. So to what extent is there going to be a hierarchy of data and knowledge, for example? Is there some that's going to be more legible to the audiences we want to speak to? And and kind of drawing on Prithvi's point there as well, how we can be transparent about that. And so kind of really how that participatory encounter is going to be used after it's happened, and within like the very real kind of context of the project, right, where you have your information and you want to generate outputs and learning and share that with people.
Bryony actually reminded me of something as well, and like as I was saying earlier, about the trends towards a human rights-based approach to data. So the UN in 2016 developed 6 guiding principles for this, of which I said, participation is one, and is a very important one. But even within that, one of the ideas that they do propose is thinking about participation also, as I said, throughout the processes in different stages of data collection. And that also brings in the question of the return of data to some extent. So how do we as a project also then go back to those who we interview, or those who are active participants in our data collection activities? How then do we represent, or show them the outcomes of the data collection that we've done? And that also is very much an important step in this participatory approach, and is something that is again linked to questions of accountability, and both of which are, the question of accountability is not just important from the humanitarian perspective, but also, I guess, from a general research ethos perspective.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, guys. And as you're talking, I'm thinking how this is really feels like the beginning of a conversation that I'm really glad we've had in this format, to open up the issues that we've been grappling with in a very practical sense. And for clarification, we're early in the project, right? This project started last October. We are now at the beginning of February 2021. We're preparing for a first phase of fieldwork, which is going to be quite exploratory phase, a shorter phase than the main one, which we will carry out later in the year. In a way, I was struck when we were talking, we're trying to talk about how we are sort of navigating this participation. I think Prithvi used this really nice term of negotiating participation, which I think is, really a nice term. But we're right at the beginning of this, and in a way, in our language, we're talking about IDPs in this very sort of abstract, distanced way, I think. As we go into the first phase, when we're actually trialing the visualization tool, for example, that Grant has developed, while we're trialing the more sort of engaged, conversational, informing type of semi-structured interviews that we're developing, we'll start to see, how meaningful can this negotiation of participation be in practice? How can we deal with the limits of that? But these important questions about how we maintain this throughout, but always thinking about, how we are going to be bringing this knowledge back, and maintaining that sort of conversational mutual learning, which, I think is obviously a huge thing, but really exciting to embark on. And I think the other thing that I was thinking while we're talking is that if we're going to be having this conversation over time, that the researchers in the field who are, doing the kind of face-to-face work with our interviewees, with our research participants, that, the conversation also flows within the team, isn't it? That there's this sort of discussion that we have as a really quite a large team, and that this effort, the continual effort to break down the power dynamics and the hierarchies within which we are operating, that, the work to sort of challenge and unpick, undo those is also sort of happening within our research team. Or I think that I would like to put that forward as an aspiration as we move forward. So I think we're out of time, but just a warm thanks to you all for your really interesting insights. And yeah, looking forward to continuing these discussions. Thank you.